Hi everyone, and welcome to Art Basel Conversations. My name is Jenny Fulton, and I'm the executive editor at Art Basel. And I'm really pleased and honoured to introduce an incredibly important panel titled Stonewall at 50, What Now? As many of you may know, 50 years ago, the Stonewall riots took place in New York. And it was a foundational moment in the fight for LGBTQIA plus rights in the US. 50 years on, this panel brings together artists with a wide-ranging viewpoints to discuss the impact of queer culture in the fight for equal rights and potential approaches for the battle ahead, given the political context in which we find ourselves now. The question, in many ways, has never been more urgent. And I would like to introduce the panel, beginning on the furthest away. That's the artist A. Bronson, who's based between Toronto and Berlin. Sharmistha Ray, an artist, writer, and educator, also hailing from New York. Carlos Motta, an artist based in New York. And moderator is Stuart, who is the Lonti Ebers Chief Curator of Media and Performance at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Stuart, would you like to take it away?
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us, and thanks especially to these panelists who are about to share their thoughts about this anniversary of Stonewall and many of the broader questions, perhaps, about how we might think about queer culture or queer lives at this point in time, 50 years on. There was a lot of New York in that introduction, but even though all of us have been engaged or lived in New York for some period of time, I'm actually the only US-born member of this panel, and so I think we're all hoping to address a broader global conversation, which might problematize the centrality of Stonewall itself within a very American discourse about queer politics and about gay liberation. I think AA, when we had breakfast this morning, pointed out that the Gay Pride March in Miami gathers double the number of people as Art Basel Miami, which might give you some sense of the visibility of queer culture, at least in this city where we're currently sitting. But clearly 50 years on, things have changed quite a bit from Stonewall, and arguably we are in a more global queer culture as we are in a more global culture in general. But things have really changed, and we've gone from a situation where many people were fighting to dismantle the military and fighting against heteronormative models of marriage, and now are actually subscribing to those things as, ironically, homosexuality has become legalized. And so I think we'll probably want to get into some of the distinctions between queer lives and queer lives when they become legal. What happens when they're coded versus when the language used to describe who we are becomes a more public and more broad conversation. I think one of the questions that was put to us when we were invited to participate in the panel was, to what extent has queer culture been normalized? I think it's a term we all have questions and concerns about, so we'll probably want to address that a little bit. But I think clearly one of the things that Stonewall raises is just the issue of agency and activism, and when we can actually take some degree of power into our own hands and question the situation that's been handed to us and try to remodel it somehow and remodel our own lives accordingly. So I think for me the personal is political, and I think it would be really best if we can start individually just talking a little bit about Stonewall itself and or activism, and how each of you maybe first conceived of activism in your own lives and your own work, and how your vision for the future you wanted to fight for originally gels with the contemporary moment we're in. So maybe AA, I think you've had the longest run of all of us, and I think
Is this on?
Yeah, and I would particularly like to hear from AA. From the beginning of your work, you've always really worked through collective models.
I'm not an activist, first of all.
This is true, but I think, so maybe talk about agency in your work in general, though, and how you, with General Idea and with various other very collective models that you engineered early on, you were trying to think about how gay life could be lived in somewhat radical and experimental ways. So. Or you can correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't agree with that, but anyway. In 1969, year of Stonewall, I was 23 years old, living in Toronto. And that is I remember 1969 because it's the year that the Canadian government legalized homosexuality, including homosexuality in the military. It's 1969. So when I hear all this talk about fight and battles and all of that, it's not the Canadian way to have battles and to fight for things. It's not how we do things. We kind of work behind the scenes more. And I was saying to Stuart earlier today that I come out of a background of a hippie kind of background in the 60s of founding a commune and an underground newspaper and a free school and all of that. And sexuality was never in those days, and at least in Canada, and I think it was probably the same in most of America, was that it was not an identity. It was just something you did. And I don't really remember sexuality becoming your identity, consequently the word gay, until maybe the very end of the 60s or the early 70s. And actually the first time I heard the word gay would have been around 1970 or 71 in reference to the founding of the Gay and Lesbian Center in Los Angeles. And I wasn't familiar with the word. Somebody had to explain to me what it meant. There's lots of things like that in terms of language, like things we take for granted. For example, the idea of a gay ghetto. I don't remember anything that could possibly be called a gay ghetto that I was familiar with until the mid-70s or even the late 70s. And this LGB, whatever it is, this assortment of letters, that didn't appear until I was already in my 50s. So to me, that's like, it barely exists at all. And so I think the language around all these things, I find the whole premise for the discussion problematic because it's built around a very particular idea, and it's the idea that's being marketed these days of there being a queer culture, first of all. And what is that queer culture? The queer culture that we know is the queer culture that is marketed. And the many, many queer cultures that are not marketed are therefore become somehow therefore not queer culture. I promised a friend that I would only talk about blowjobs and sex clubs up here. One example of a peculiar...
We could be here all night, eh?
In Berlin, where I live, there's, of course, all the parks are sex parks, basically, every one of them. And the city is 30% parks. It's full of parks, big parks. And one of the parks is adjacent to a Muslim cemetery. And the Muslim truck drivers, on their way home, will stop and visit their ancestors, whatever relatives are in the cemetery. And then when they come out, they go across the street into the park across the street where the white hipster boys are waiting to give them blowjobs. And the hipsters are mostly in their 20s and 30s, and the truck drivers are mainly in their 40s and 50s. And then the truck drivers get in their trucks and go home to their wives and their normal family life. And how does one describe that? Like, is that queer? I mean, what is that? I mean, it's very cultured, it's very coded, it's been going on for years, always the same. And how does that relate to queer culture? I think that's the question that I keep coming back to.
When we met this morning, you kept using the dichotomy of identity versus activity. And that, as I understand it, identity kind of locks in maybe too tight a definition for things that are a little more fluid.
Yeah, I guess in this case, the truck drivers are just involved in activity, but the guys waiting in the bushes are definitely involved in identity.
And Sharmistha, so you've had a really interesting trajectory. You were born in Calcutta and then grew up in Kuwait, you lived since then in Mumbai and in New York. Mm-hmm. And so you've had to navigate a lot of different types of communities that legislated your own queer identity in many different ways, and you've developed a practice out of that. I'm curious to what extent an event like Stonewall registered with you at any point in your trajectory, and again, how you would kind of par that with what you're thinking now about how you might develop a form of agency in your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, Stuart, because ever since I was invited to this panel, I've been wrestling with this beast, which is Stonewall, and thinking about, of course it has impacted my life. I mean, many of the freedoms that I can enjoy living in New York, which I didn't have in Mumbai, are clearly connected to to Stonewall, and I certainly enjoy those freedoms. But for me personally, when the celebrations were going on this year in New York, they were huge, but I kind of felt like I was on the outside of that looking in. Stonewall to me still registers as, if someone says Stonewall, I think of white gay men and fabulous drag queens, and there's this entire mythology around Stonewall, because I wasn't born at that time. I was not even an idea from my parents. I was an idea in the womb of the universe, perhaps. So it does feel remote to me. That said, I completely appreciate the activism that has come out of that, and some of those strategies are, some of the strategies that I've adopted in my own work. I would say that, being a queer woman of color as well, someone who has dealt with, issues of immigration for, over 20 years, and also once been a refugee, that I see the queer rights movement, if you want to call it that, and Stonewall as being a part of that, as larger civil rights movements. And Stonewall owes a debt to other civil rights movements, and the one that has impacted me the most has been the feminist movement of the 1970s. I think that, to me, feels much closer to the identity that has formed my understanding of the world and has shaped my own art. If you look at the feminist movement, it's something that translates globally as well. I lived in India and in Mumbai for more than 10 years. And there are distinct parallels in the movements of the 1970s, what feminists were doing in New York City and what feminists were doing in large cities in India as well. There are direct correlations in terms of the ways that they were thinking, the strategies that they were adopting, to really counter religio-patriarchal systems. And I think that my experience in the world, and someone who has navigated different cultures and different places, and some of those places being incredibly dangerous, firstly for women, physically and otherwise so, you're always thinking about, violence. That really it's the experience of being a woman first, and then being queer that has informed my identity. But that said, I do want to say something about Stonewall, because I was really thinking about whether it has impacted me at all, like directly. And I have an anecdote of when I was in college here in America. I came here from Kuwait. I was already out to myself, but I was coming out publicly. Felt very alienated by the campus organization, which at that time was LGBT. There was no QIA plus at that point. It was mainly composed of white gay men and women. And given the kind of intersectional identity that I had, I felt very alienated within that. But I found solace in a book called Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. I don't know if any of you have heard about that book, but Leslie Feinberg was a transgender activist and a writer. And I was so moved by that book, I actually invited Leslie Feinberg. I raised the funds. I went to Williams College, and it was a very, again, it was very white at the time. I think it's diversified a little bit now. But I invited Leslie Feinberg to campus, and it was kind of like a revolution just to have them there. And they spoke, and I was so moved by Leslie's sense of humanity and what she had been through, and just her deep empathy. And also, I think what stayed with me was their non-conforming identity. And the reason I bring Leslie Feinberg up is that Leslie Feinberg has addressed Stonewall in their book, Stone Butch Blues. And so really I feel that I experienced Stonewall through their eyes, which is really my one direct link with Stonewall, that it was narrated to me through the eyes of someone who was gender non-conforming, someone who is a non-conformist. And I think that something that transcends gender and sexuality for me is just being a non-conforming person and being comfortable within that skin and within that space, and realizing that once you kind of own that space for yourself, that people essentially then do move to allow you to breathe, and you kind of have to reclaim your oxygen in the room.
Carlos?
Yeah, so I was born in 1978, which is, I guess, 9 years after that event. And I was developing as a young gay boy in Colombia, which at the time and in the specific social space in which I was growing up was fairly conservative and quite isolated. And I remember constantly trying to find references and models to build my life off of, to compare the feelings I was having. And there were very few around and very few available. Having said that, Colombia was also a country at the time in the 1980s that was receiving a ton of influence from the United States. And I think this is perhaps true to a lot of Latin America. So my first encounters with gay culture and sexuality and questions of sexual transgression, etc., come from American pop culture, right? So, for example, I am one of those gays whose idea of sex responds to Madonna's sex book. Right? That's a thing. But having said that, so to me, the narrative around Stonewall, which is something I learned when I was a teenager, became a point of identification, you know, of understanding through the myth of that event that there was a community of like-minded people who felt similarly or felt the same way as I thought I was doing at the time. And then later on, I started to think about Stonewall in two different ways. One, that myth of revolt, that myth of confronting strategies of marginalization and discrimination. And then one that I think of more recently is Stonewall, the event, as a point of rupture. And in that regard, I'm more interested in thinking of other points of rupture that may have predated Stonewall, points in which there was a kind of social movement that resisted being obliterated, discriminated upon, etc. And I think what I have been trying to do in my life and my work is go back as far as I can to find those points of rupture, to find those moments when communities came together, resisted silently, secretly, and still managed to live queer lives without being named. So I've been interested in looking 500 years before Stonewall, if you will, to try to find traces of those lives and the ways in which they were named as othered and also criminalized and named as something that needed to be considered marginal. So I think Stonewall to me is a point of reference, but it's also a point of retrospectively looking at a process that made it available to happen, you know, to exist as an event that I think queer life changed very radically from then on. It was named, as you say, perhaps before that there wasn't really a name for that. And I think that continues to be the case in many communities around the world, that this question of naming oneself as such is something that we could also think about, because it doesn't necessarily correspond to the way that people feel, but it's more a way of belonging to structures that are maybe outside one's sense of self. So yeah, I guess my relationship to it is really as a myth and then as an event, and how I've been able to respond to both of those things.
I mean, this makes me think about two questions. One is, to what degree is Stonewall a brand, like an American brand that's been marketed like Coca-Cola and anything else, you know, and how does that, I mean, I think we're in a marketplace here at an art fair, and I think you have to address the commercialization of queer culture. I mean, maybe, I don't know, you could talk certainly about general idea and how you came up with alternative models of distribution, or sort of dealt with this idea of the commodity in a really subversive way. And I don't know how that played into later work about AIDS that you made or not. But I think, for me, the idea of distribution is one question. And then the second one would be more about queer space and the idea as, you know, New York City or Greenwich Village as a platform, you know, of visibility. And then increasingly that became, as A mentioned earlier, a series of gay ghettos internationally. And a lot of those now have started to evolve into something else that are not exclusively gay ghettos, and a lot of queer life has gone online like everything else, and it's, you know, acted out through apps. It's not as visible on the streets anymore. And so in a way, that's a very different outcome from something like Stonewall. But maybe just to quickly go back to this idea of the marketing of Stonewall, I don't know if any of you have further thoughts about that. AA does not, apparently.
Not really, no.
I guess because both of you are talking about it from a more international point of view as well, and as a sort of, you know, looking to the States as a model, looking to Stonewall as a model.
I think there's something that society likes very much is finding points of origin, and I think Stonewall serves that role very well. It serves a role for an origin story about reivindication of rights, about building agendas, political and social agendas for the advancement of social standing or placement. And as such, I think that, I mean, we need to be very careful because Stonewall was also like a very real event, right? It was, it was a violent event that was responding to violent behaviors against the people who frequented that locality, trans persons who were not allowed to be there, you know, like the heavily kind of policing and surveillance of that place. And I think it's really important to honor that space as something that happened. And not only there, it was also a symbol for something that was happening and continues to happen in so many places around the world. But at the same time, I think that resisting that origin story is also important, and thinking about how, as an origin story, it becomes this marker for a political strategy that I think has, in many ways, tried to streamline or normalize identities to correspond to certain ideas of how a person is supposed to behave in society, the kind of models they need to follow, the kind of values they have to subscribe to in order to promote the idea of family, for example, or monogamy, or the idea of how, you know, all of these things that are fairly traditional notions. And I think subscribing to that origin story has been a kind of gradual process where gays are respectable. And these communities, you know, the idea is that I would never present myself as different. I'm just the same as you. I'm as equal as you. When in reality, we continue to live lives that are not like that, are different. And I've always been interested in remembering that we are different. We see the world differently. I actually do not want to see the world in that other way. And so to me, the risk is that that origin story has erased the more nuanced and the much more exciting and sexy and kind of fantastical ways of being in the world.
I mean, one last point, only very recently a Hollywood film about Stonewall came out, which was still spinning out a largely white gay male narrative and kind of reinforcing the origin story that had already been sort of put forth. But I mean, all you have to do is go onto YouTube and see Sylvia Rivera's incredibly powerful speech in Washington Square Park, and it just completely erases any memory you might have had of the Hollywood version of the story, you know? I mean, and Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, I mean, a lot of the trans activists involved in that moment are finally getting their due. And so the extent to which, you know, people always joke that if you put every single person that claimed they were at Stonewall together, it would fill a stadium larger than Yankee Stadium. You know? So, you know, it is a fiction on some level, but as Carlos points out, it was very definitely a real event and a very violent one. I think, Sharmistha, you said earlier this morning, too, that it was a footprint of many overlapping political movements. It was not just the queer movement. I mean, you highlighted the feminist movement as well, but there were a lot of political movements happening at that moment.
Yeah, I do want to say something about the branding of Stonewall. I mean, of course, there's, as Carlos was saying, there's the origin story, and then it's now what has kind of become as kind of a cultural myth, right? And I have multiple perspectives on this because I kind of am on the inside but on the outside as well. I mean, having lived in societies like the Middle East, in Kuwait, and in India, in Mumbai, which actually, I mean, has more of a rich queer life now than it ever did before, thanks to a few activists, that I think that it just feels wonderful to be, you know, when all these celebrations were going on, I didn't feel like it was my celebration per se, but I could also enjoy it and appreciate that we've come to this moment where, you know, people can be so out and they can live their lives. And I think that part of, the agency, early agency of these movements was to give people the right to live normal lives, right? That everyone doesn't have to be an activist. That there are some people, I'm not one of those who are normative and necessarily has been chasing normalcy my whole life, but I certainly appreciate when my actions have allowed other people to do that. I would, have women in India write to me privately and say that my visibility, gave them hope of coming out one day, or kind of, having a life that, that they didn't have to live in secret, and things like that. That's why visibility is important. And I think that's something that other movements have taught us, that we have to name things. Even though, I would like to just go along like everybody else, but that's just not been a choice, because it is a political act to name something, and it is important to have that visibility. And I would see it in a way that probably was the case here in the 1960s and the 1970s, that it is absolutely important to name those things, because that's what gives those things visibility, and it's what provides hope to so many people. So I appreciate that Stonewall has become this celebration. I think it's inevitable, given the capitalist structures, the larger capitalist structures in which we exist, that subsumes everything, sometimes in order to neutralize it and rob it of its agency. But I think that there are always going to be people who fight for what is right. And in India, this is something that I mentioned at breakfast this morning, Stuart, is that India struck down the law that criminalized homosexuality, Section 377, which was a Victoria-era law. It was introduced by the British. And India struck it down last year. And the Supreme Court did that. But by no means does that mean that culture at large is accepting of queer identities at all. If you know the inside story, it was a very small group of the liberal elite, of intellectuals who came together and said, this has got to change, right? So you're talking about a very, very small group of people who are already the cultural elite of the country, who are already incredibly privileged, who are English speaking, moving this through the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, thankfully, even though we have a very pro-fascist government right now, has always been an autonomous body, and it has by and large always been liberal. So it's almost, there's this kind of, it's kind of dystopic in a way, because at one point, there are people who can continue to, who can actually live more open lives, but there is still a sense of danger and vulnerability at large. And I think that seeing where, America has arrived at in New York with this whole idea of Stonewall, I can also celebrate that. It may not be my story, but I can celebrate that, that it's arrived at this place.
I guess I wanted to talk for a minute too about the Stonewall, the bar itself, not just the event, and the degree to which I moved back to New York from London in 2013, and 2013, and it's amazing to me that the Stonewall Inn is still there and the Julius is still there. I believe Julius is listed, and I think the Stonewall Inn is as well. In London, a year after I left, 19 gay bars closed. And you could chalk that up to any number of reasons, from gentrification to the apps taking over to whatever you want. But nonetheless, it was shocking to me that such a rich part of my life in that city was gone overnight. And
Barney's is just closed in New York.
And Barney's is closed too, and Dina DeLuca. But and I guess the degree to which we need to institutionalize these histories and create icons like the Stonewall Inn versus, it might be interesting to hear you talk about Berlin, for instance, now as more of a living situation where young queer life, I think, is very much alive and well, and not necessarily feeling beholden to older institutions and trying to kind of reinvent them. But the degree to which, literally just having these bars in place still as anchors for these communities, as much as those communities are dispersed and atomized. For me, it's a big question, because I think queer life was often connected to urban situations, even though that's not entirely accurate. And we were saying this morning, I know I have friends in Northern California who are very invested in the lesbian communities in the Redwoods, for instance, or in rural communities. But anyway, maybe if you could talk a little bit, maybe even compare what Toronto in the 70s was like versus Berlin now.
I don't know that would be a very difficult comparison to make. Berlin has a long, long, complicated history, and I'm not talking about the Nazis. I'm going way further back than that. And I'll try to keep it brief. I could talk for an hour and a half about that. If you go back to the mid 1800s, there's the idea of FKK, Freikorperkultur, comes up, which was an idea about living healthily in nature, naked in nature as much as possible, eating healthy foods, so on and so forth. And Berlin was one of the major centers for that very Germanic idea. And in fact, it's the first health food store in California, in the US, was opened by a couple from Berlin who moved to California, to LA, I think it was, in like 1928 or something. And there are other, you can see how the whole kind of hippie movement and everything, and the health store movement and so on, were exported to the US from mostly Berlin. But there's a big gay component in there, a big gay component as well. In World War I, this is kind of making a big leap, but in World War I, the women all went to work in the factories, and the men were mainly killed, frankly. And the children were basically out on the streets on their own. And when the war ended, the women couldn't afford to come home from the factories. They continued to work in the factories. And there was there was a kind of life on the streets of kind of wild teenagers, let's call them, which was the basis for William Burroughs' book, The Wild Boys. It's very strange how ritualized it became. So these gangs of kids organized themselves regionally around the periphery of the city, because the city is basically circular. It actually isn't a city, it's a state, and it's a collection of 8 cities which joined together when the S-Bahn was built, that joined them together. It became a city, but before that it was really 8 cities. And it's still, there's a city hall in each of those 8 cities. It's 8 different governments. And these kids formed themselves into gangs around the communities they were in. And then they formed organizations for a quarter of a ring and then for the whole ring. And they had very complicated initiation rites, which involved basically everything that takes place in the sex clubs of Berlin today. There was a lot of homosexual activity involved in all these clubs, and it led eventually to the Nazi youth. The Nazis figured out how to harness the energy of that, and it was fed into Nazi youth. But in the meantime, it laid a kind of, it's too complicated to go into here. Even different clubs had different styles of clothing, and they're all clothing styles that you will find in any gay bar today. It's a very peculiar history. And then leap ahead to World War II, or after World War II, when Berlin was walled off, when West Berlin was walled off, the Western Berliners were given the option, if they didn't want to be conscripted into the army, they could move to Berlin. And so Berlin attracted all the most left-wing elements of young people in Berlin. In Germany, they all moved to Berlin, and you got an extremely radical culture beginning to develop there, and again, extremely gay culture. So today, there's a vast infrastructure of gay organizations. There's the Schwules Museum, which is a gay museum, which is supposedly the biggest institution of its type. And that dates back actually to sex work, also from the 1800s and so on. And there's an infrastructure of bars and clubs and sex clubs and forests and et cetera, et cetera. And the most remarkable thing about it is that there's no morality attached to anything. So it becomes a kind of a system through which everybody moves, but without judgment. A friend of mine from Toronto who lived there for some time, he did his PhD there, and he was also a sex worker. And he said it's like one of the few places in the world where you could be openly a PhD student and openly a sex worker simultaneously, and you could hold multiple identities. And this is something that Peaches, for example, has talked about. One of the reasons that she's been based in Berlin is because she can play with multiple identities out of that place, and with what I would call queer identities. So that's a bit of a mumbling,
But I guess
not very focused. But
Carlos
Can I
has
say
something. Go ahead. Yeah. Jump
No,
in.
I was hearing you speak. It became important to me to bring two things about gay clubs and bars. One is that historically gay clubs and bars have been also places of ritual, places of congregation where communities come together and perform things. One anecdote that I like very much about Julius, the bar in New York, which I believe is the oldest gay bar in the city, and it's now the building is a landmark. So for those of you that have been would know this, if you haven't, it is a corner building, and there are windows on both sides. So it's basically like a window onto the street. And the story tells that very early on, men would have to all be facing out because the police was very aware of what was happening there, and if they were facing in, they would always raid the bar. So there was this kind of social choreography where they were all facing out, looking onto the street, right, to make sure that there wasn't the belief that they were touching each other, although perhaps most likely they were touching each other's butts or something, standing that way. But I just like that idea of how these places become these spaces of, the performance of these rituals that build communities on the one hand. And on the other one, I think gay bars and clubs have also been some of the most important sites for political organizing. And I've been working on a project right now about undocumented migrants that are part of the Dreamer movement. And one of the things that has come up in this process of interviewing everyone here is how the bar, for lives that are conditioned at the moment by so much hostility in terms of immigration policy and being or not being visible at the risk of deportation, all of these things is how dance parties and dance bars are the places where these communities come and are able to really take off all of that political weight. And so Julio Salgado, one of the subjects of my project, is always really going back to the idea of the bar as a place that we really need to consider as one of the gay bar as a place that we really need to consider as one of the most important kind of staples of a community, not only for entertainment and fun, but also for political purposes.
It's interesting. I'm just thinking even the artist Wu Sang made a film called Wildness. It's about the Silver Platter, which is the oldest queer bar, I think, in California, and definitely the oldest trans bar. But most of the performers there are from Latin America. A lot of them are illegal immigrants, and most of them are sex workers. And I think that bar has become a site where it's really the front lines of the fight for sex workers' rights, but also for immigration rights. And I think these things do get, I'm going to use the word AA hates, entangled, but in really complex and fascinating ways at that one bar, for instance. But I mean, I do see the gay bar as still a pretty urgent space to investigate and to think about. But I guess it gets back to my question, though, about what are the dangers of commemorating these things and focusing too much on the history versus what are the futures we want to see? And this gets back to the question posed to all of us for this panel, which is the kind of hyper-visibility now of gay culture. And, I mean, Stonewall was a front-page headline for its 50th anniversary. And the original event did allow mainstream representations of gay life, on the front page of every newspaper in the country, which had not happened previously. So it's just a question, I guess, it is a strange, precarious moment for so many reasons, but in terms of, your individual lives, and, I mean, do you feel political agency is possible for this community right now, at least through the work you're doing? It's a tough question, I know, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the work is really one of the only places left where one can have, I mean, unless one is an activist, which I don't see myself as an activist. I have certainly been involved in activism at various points in my life, but you know, I don't want to take away from the activists who are doing this day in and day out and actually affecting change on the front lines. I'm not one of them. But I think over time, you know, especially when you know, market structures exclude you, you know, not only women artists, but queer women artists, and it just goes on and on and on, right? The more intersectional your identity is, the more you're kind of left out of certain conversations, which is kind of ironic that I'm here at Art Basel. But I'm enjoying the irony of it. But I think that as time goes by, you just invest in the work. Even if people aren't necessarily looking at that moment, or the people that you want to have interested in your work, you know, may not be paying attention in that moment. You know, I think that the ritual is in the work for me, because you know, the clubs are not the way that, you know, that I kind of came into my own. It hasn't shaped me. I feel very left out on this panel because I've never been to a sex club. I'm still young, it could happen. But jokes aside, I think that more and more, I think it's in the work. For me, it's as an artist, it's as a writer. I think writer gives me sometimes the feeling of more agency because it's direct, it's communication, and you know, there's a distribution there, which sometimes feels a little bit easier, you know, than the visual work. Easier in terms of distribution and, you know, people seeing it and engaging with it. And education, I mean, that's also a way that, you know, you kind of pass on your DNA. So that has been something that has becoming more and more important to me. So I think I'm rambling too now, AA. But
well, I have a quick question for AA, though. So, I mean, a lot of people in this very difficult current political moment keep talking about how strategies of intimacy and friendship have been very helpful for them, or, you know, on keeping your friends and your enemies close to some degree. AA, I guess I'm really interested, just given that certainly your work with General ID and a lot of the projects earlier in your career were very much collective models, but then subsequently your work as a healer or your work through a lot of different kinds of spiritual practices have tended to be much more about like one-on-one models or very intimate models. And yeah, I don't know. I just would be curious to hear you talk a little bit about the more recent work you've been doing and how that might create a very different kind of space than what we've been talking about in terms of queer bars and more conventional forms of public gathering.
Well, there's also the invocation of the queer spirits works, or maybe might even be more
exactly
appropriate for that. So General Idea was founded in '69. My two partners, Jorge and Felix, died in '94 of AIDS. And I mean, I started collaborating when I was 23, and when they died, I was 48, I think. And I realized I actually had no idea how to make art without collaborating. I'd never done it before. And so what I eventually began to do was, in fact, collaborate again, and collaborate mostly with younger generations, because, in fact, the interesting people of my generation are mostly dead, so they weren't of much use. I found that there was an eagerness to collaborate from a younger queer generation, because there was a need for a kind of role model, and maybe not so much role model. Maybe it's more about wanting to be seen as who they were, and not as who their parents, for example, wanted them to be, or who their teachers might want them to be, but rather who they felt they were. They wanted somebody to just acknowledge that they were who they felt they were. And so I began a healing practice, which you've mentioned, and really that's all I did for people, was to help them picture who they were at that moment, and to acknowledge the value of that, of who they were, just their very being at that moment. And then I began to think about the people who were dead. And I realized that to a large extent I was drawing on my experience with people who were no longer around. And I began to realize that I was part of a community of the living and the dead, that the living and the dead together, because so many people died and my generation died, were effectively my community. And I began a series of, I called them performances, which were kind of gatherings in different cities mostly, where a group of people, depending on how many people there were who wanted to be involved, would get together, and we would start at midnight and usually go till dawn, and there was a kind of ritual involved. And as part of the ritual, I had a text I would read, which was my invocation of the spirits of the dead in that place. And so, for example, I was really looking at communities which we don't normally think of as queer communities, but I think very much are. And for example, in New Orleans, there were the 20 or so pirate ships which were parked outside of New Orleans for 200 years. And it was an all-male community. And I don't think anybody knows what went on those pirate ships. But I would say the same as in all-male prisons, there's something very queer about a community of pirate ships outside of New Orleans. And so I drew on those kinds of communities, on communities of loggers and woodsmen and cowboys and trappers, and in different places, these different all-male communities and their particular histories. What else can I say about that? I mean, it was really just to feel the presence of those people with us and to acknowledge our existence communally as a community.
No, I think that's beautiful. I have one tiny point. Let's let Carlos make a point, and then we should open it up. But I do think it's important just to recognize a few days ago was World AIDS Day, which has also now become often known as Day Without Art. But to revisit a history of something like Stonewall, you have to take into account that a lot of the people that would have been here to witness it and revisit it with us are not here to do that. And so it's a different kind of thinking about how we do tell that history. And there are survivors who are here to talk about it, but there are a lot of people who are not. And so it does complicate the process, I think.
Yeah, I just also wanted to speak about the dead because I'm very interested in the ways in which, because the law and religion have had such strong ways at shaping the perception and understanding of what a queer, sexually or gender otherwise different body is. I've been interested in having also a conversation with the dead through working in archives and finding those colonial cases that were people who were named as a sodomite or a sorcerer or someone who defied the kind of tight relationship between the law and Christian morality in the Latin American context, became these kind of role models, right? In very traumatic and negative terms, right? So somebody who may have been a sodomite in Brazil in the 16th century is only known to us as such because of that perceived transgression of the law and of morality. And in a way that maybe resembles your invocations, I've been interested in having a conversation with those subjects, which is transhistorical and fictional, but also spiritual and kind of important for me to think about ways in which, through the work that I've been doing in constructing alternative archives, alternative histories, we could shape the terms of the narration of those stories, so that those people who exist in those archives like that can also be imagined as having had full, happy lives with agency and ways of existing in the world other than the way that they have been archived as othered.
And as we open it up, I'll just mention we did talk about Andrew Cunanan and Versace to be Miami specific this morning, but just how this idea of criminality has still, to this day, been constantly attached to it. And the photo, I think, that appeared on one of the major New York daily newspapers after the Stonewall riots, tried to refer to a lot of the protesters as street kids and tried to kind of criminalize them effectively for their actions. We would love to hear any questions you might have or comments or anything you'd all like to contribute to the conversation. Just here in the front. Yeah. I think there's a mic right behind you, if you can wait 1 sec.
Yes, to Carlos, I'm from Brazil. I'm from Arte Brasileiros. And still now I saw a huge exhibition at the Vermelhos Gallery. And what I saw is that you work with thinking about something would happen 500 years ago are happen now, and nothing moving. So the question is how, and for all, how think not about the Stonewall of 50s or our generation of the 70s, but just now, when we suppose that we are discussion questions absolutely normal and very democratic questions, we have governments that treat our liberty and sexual and also raising questions as 200 years ago. I suppose the question is this: what happened that we are discussing the same things? Because we are in the democracy, but we are really, really working with these problems all the day as discrimination, So I try to understand what you suppose that your work increase this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you're spot on. One of the things that I've found in all of these cases, colonial archives from Spain, Portugal, and all over the Americas, is that they really reproduce an idea of what happens in the present, and that things have not changed so much. And so through this project, I'm really trying to question the idea of progress. How is it that progress is constructed? How do we perceive progress? What does it take for progress to be enacted? How does it work? So I think in that case, I've been reading Benjamin's idea around progress, right, as something that is cyclical. And also that this LGBTQ plus situation responds to very much, which I think is kind of neglecting to create substantial changes with the past by going upon a road that has been paved by, so to speak, normalcy or respectability politics and all of those things. So I'm interested in thinking about, how small, intimate gestures, small revisions of certain stories can disrupt that idea of progress and actually maybe inhabit them from a more personal sense rather than expecting these kind of large social things to happen. And in the case of Brazil right now, I think these small arcs of resistance are so important. I think everybody needs to be really aware of resisting these forces of violence that are very much conditioning the well-being of people at the most fundamental levels. For example, access to HIV medication is something that is really seriously threatened right now in Brazil when people are really thinking about how can I get access to medication, how can I get access to PrEP, do I need to leave? Yeah.
Can I also form a response to that? Just tying in something Stuart had brought up earlier about intimacy. I think that intimacy itself feels so radical, right? I mean, even though we're so connected to each other through social media, I mean, are we really having, human exchanges? I think we're almost starved for that, right? And so there is a kind of larger alienation happening. I think within my own work, the shift that I've seen is that my, last exhibition, well, not my, yeah, my last exhibition was called We Are All Islands, and it was talking about the condition of isolation and alienation, but through the lens of queerness and immigration and the post-colonial identity. And so there were these kind of larger statements being made. And after that, I kind of retreated into the space where I really wanted, rather than making larger generalized statements of the world that we live in, was really seeking a one-on-one with my work. And so for the last year, I've been actually making yantras, which are ritualistic drawings from the tantric tradition. And they were really about the worshiper and the vehicle through which they worshipped this larger entity, right? Whatever you want to call that. And I do that through writing, so I build up these yantras through writing. But it really is a conversation, which is a one-on-one. I've been seeking how I can find that sense of intimacy, not through just friendships and community, which have become really important, and sometimes with unexpected people. It's not, you don't always find likeness with the like. You sometimes find it in the unexpected places, and they become your family and your community. But it also is in the work now that how can I build the greatest amount, how can I build that intimacy and get beyond the politics of the whole and return to oneself through the work?
Two in the middle there, and sorry, TM.
Thank you, Stuart. That's a kind of a complicated question, but knowing Carlos and AA, often naked on a beach, I wonder, I don't know, I guess the question is, considering Stonewall, that maybe the idea of forming identities that were, that sort of are increasingly more specific to sexual desire and in some ways fracturing to the community. But AA, you spoke to the idea that naturism or body freedom inherently allows often a space for queerness to exist. I wonder if we can speak to the idea that maybe body freedom is the sort of more unifying agenda that could sort of propel a future, or if that complicates it.
I'm not sure what your question is, I guess.
I guess the question is, do you see part of the work as being body freedom? Do you see part of the work of today in your own, in the space of creating spaces of freedom to assert spaces for nudity or spaces for...
Well, being in Berlin, the work's already been done for me, right? I mean, it's you can be naked in a major shopping street and nobody will pay the slightest bit of attention. It's just like kind of, what's he doing? But and you can certainly be naked in any park and nobody cares. So I don't think of it in terms of something that I'm like pushing as an agenda, but it's certainly something that I think is extremely healthy. Also, all those kind of spa facilities, I think in Germany and most of Scandinavia, are mixed gender and naked, and it's, I think, extremely healthy and very healthy for children as well.
I think maybe, can I clarify?
Yeah.
I guess I'm thinking in terms of when in protest now, if you're in New York City and you're
in protest. Well,
as an example, in protest in New York City, I think I'm becoming increasingly aware that our bodies are being kind of heavily policed even as we're protesting. I mean, everything is incredibly controlled. But I just wonder if because we've lost focus of the idea of body freedom as the main concept, that we're sort of allowing for small policings to occur, and if that complicates.
For the 25th anniversary of Stonewall in the Gay Pride Parade, I walked naked up Fifth Avenue, which was a really interesting experience somehow. It was just, within about 30 seconds, it just felt totally normal. It was kind of really bizarre. There was a small group of us, and so what? We were just walking naked up Fifth Avenue all the way to Central Park. It was so peculiar, really.
We're just about out of time, so I just wanted to take two more questions that were just in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. What a wonderful conversation. triggered by something that AA said and sort of your practice of, let's say, intergenerational collaboration, kind of that you said that there was kind of a strong need among sort of younger sort of queer people to learn perhaps from sort of a generation like before them. And I want to pose this to all of you because I think you all have sort of experiences in that regard. What do you feel are some of the most striking similarities, but also things that may be experienced very, in a different way when it comes to sort of personal agency, sort of a political action, whatever you want to focus on between, let's say, the 2-3 generations that are still alive?
I don't understand what you're asking. Sorry.
Well, let's say maybe let's just bring it down a little bit. You said, okay, there was really a need for a lot of young people to be working with, let's say, you and your generation. In those sort of collaborations, I was wondering what kind of sort of alignments you may have felt and where sort of the differences may have been in sort of sensibilities, in sort of thinking about sort of the agency one might have, the politics, etc.
Well, my way of collaborating with a younger person has always been kind of similar to what I used to do when I was teaching, which is to look over the person's shoulder and try to see what they're seeing and to help focus it and give it form. So, which is something that was taught to me by Jean-Christophe Amann, one of the great curators of our time. When General Idea did a solo exhibition with him at the Kunsthalle Basel in '84, he described his way of working with artists as being that he liked to look over their shoulder and consider himself. He didn't try to control what happened, but rather tried to focus the artist's own desires and methods. So I've kind of taken Jean-Christophe's method, and that's how I try to work with younger people. And I think in the end it's more about being seen. Like there's not really a difference between me and them because I'm in a way working on their project. My project is to work on their project, which is kind of a strange thing. And so it's really more the fact that I see their project as having value and being of enough value that I'm willing to work on it too. That's the more what it's about, I think.
And I'd like to add something to that because as I've started to age and I teach, one of the things that has become really interesting to me is seeing how this process of teaching and mentorship is actually just a process of listening and paying attention. Because as I see, for example, right now, when you come to a class with like this chronology or timeline of queer struggles, or what you think are the most important and definitive moments in queer history, the younger generation, my students right now at Pratt, for example, they have their own entire idea about what are the most important moments right now, right? To shift the narrative around AIDS, for example, which to me is central. They're like, fuck that. We have to think about gender activism, trans activism, gender nonconformity. This is much more important to us right now than this kind of narrative is. And that has been really great. Aging has become, we're kind of like 3 generations. Like if you're one, I'm a second one, then these students are another one where it is actually, I'm learning so much more from them than I can ever give them. And I think that the task as somebody who's aging and is queer is to really understand how you can foster that relationship to be never about a top-down thing, but always cyclical and always nurturing. And the one thing that I never want to lose in my life is touch with that reality, right? To think that I know a truth, because as things, going back to your question, I think things are constantly circling and changing, and we need to be able to always understand that yes, we may have understood something at some point, but now we have to completely shift the narrative and listen to the ways in which people are doing it.
And in being so alert, I think hopefully we'll hear a lot more voices. We're out of time, so thank you all so much for coming.